Okay, we are live. Welcome back to the Ink Live. I'm so excited for a special edition today with a very special guest who will be familiar to all of you. Former Secretary of Transportation, former presidential candidate on the Democratic side, Pete Buttigieg. Mr. Secretary, always so good to see you with a new look. New look. You're now a bearded American.
Yeah, at least for the moment.
And you're coming to us today as the image behind you reminds us, live from Iowa, um, which is a completely random state. No, no special significance. So we'll get to that later. But I want to ask you first. I think it's on a lot of people's minds. This air travel
Mm.
crisis
Yep.
that is unfolding across this country, and of course, as everything now seems to cause, there's this kind of complete split screen story of what's going on, who's to blame. I fear that if a nuclear weapon landed in this country, it would also result in a
Yep.
partisan bickering about who did what. But can you just explain what is happening? Do you look back and see any kind of failures and limitations in what was done during the Biden administration? And then what culpability do you think Trump has?
So I'm less interested in blame and more interested in problem solving, which is what we did on my watch and what my successor needs to focus on too. So the reality is we have had an FAA system, an aviation system that has been really starting to show just how rickety it is more and more over time. And there's really three pieces to that. I would say technology, infrastructure, workforce. So on workforce, air traffic control staffing has been declining for decades, or it had been declining for decades. We turned that around. There was a shortage. We saw a big shortfall in the number of controllers there were. We got that number to be growing again. It was still going to take a while to catch up to where it needed to be, but we finally turned around the shrinking air traffic control workforce we had and handed a growing workforce to my successor. I don't know if it's growing or shrinking today. I'd have some concerns based on the buyout emails that went out and some of the other things that have gone at the FAA. But that's one piece. Second piece is the infrastructure. So that's why we push so hard on an infrastructure bill. It's basic airport infrastructure that's part of our aviation system. And I'm really glad that we were able to do a lot on that. We're here in Cedar Rapids today. Went through an airport terminal yesterday that the last time I was there was a construction site because we funded a set of improvements to that a couple of years ago. Now the project is almost done. It's making a big difference. Then you got the third piece, maybe the toughest one of all, which is the technology. So you've got a technology that has been bolted on kind of one system at a time, really since the 50s. And there are a lot of elements of it that need
That's
to
comforting.
change. Yeah, but remember, I mean, part of why it's the way it is, part of why the FAA has been conservative about changing it is that that system, with all of its flaws, delivered unbelievable results in terms of aviation safety. We went 15 years with zero fatal commercial airliner crashes, which is, I mean, if we could get anywhere close to that record on something like cars, trucks, and buses, it would save literally hundreds of thousands of lives over that period of time. But the system clearly needs to change. I was enormously frustrated with the technology we had. So one of the things we did on my watch was launch a contract to take the technology that's there, especially this communications backbone, basically copper wire, same as the old telephone systems that we had decades ago, move it to an internet-based system, IP fiber. All I know now is what I read in the news. I heard that they were stopping that contract or pausing it or evaluating it, looking at maybe giving it to Elon Musk's Starlink company. Now it sounds like they changed their mind about that. I can't really tell what's going on that with that much detail. Obviously, I'm on the outside looking in. What I know is that accelerating a technology upgrade, which my successor said he wants to do, is a good thing. So if that's actually what he's about, I'm going to be cheering him on because we inherited aging infrastructure. We did our part when I was in office to accelerate those upgrades. But it's going to take a lot of things. It's going to take focus. It's going to take discipline. It's going to take money. And we will see whether the people now in charge have the focus and discipline and whether Congress will give them the money to pick up the pace. If they do, this is not a partisan thing. I will be the first, both as somebody who was very close to these issues and as a member of the traveling public who's on a plane just about every week. I will be cheering on this secretary and this administration if they are actually serious about getting results.
Do you think this is, um, in some ways, the chaos right now is the inevitable consequence of a political movement that makes war on government, that talks down the idea of government, that kind of valorizes a chainsaw as the appropriate way of dealing with government agencies? Do you think that this is where that kind of thinking inevitably lands?
I think that's a very real phenomenon. Look, I remember during some of the shutdown close calls, there was the same thing where you had congressional Republicans in particular portraying anybody who works for the government as a faceless bureaucrat in Washington D.C. And meanwhile, I'm thinking about our, among other things, our air traffic controllers and what I'm supposed to tell them if they're not getting paid because of the government shutdown. So if you have this mentality that anybody who's in public service is basically a waste of resources, or worse. I mean, what I forget which Trump administration official came in said that their goal was to quote traumatize the federal workforce. Well, obviously, when you do that, that's going to have an effect on people who are coming in every day to do these jobs, which are both wildly important and very difficult. The last thing I want any air traffic controller to be worried about or thinking about is whether the administration that they work in is going to come after their job. They'll get this email saying that let us know if you want to quit and do something more productive in the private sector. Only to have the secretary then say, "Oh, that was never supposed to go to the air traffic controllers. We didn't mean it." So, like obviously, that kind of stuff isn't helping. What would help is to have some consistency, some support, and yeah, a lot of change. I mean, I think anybody who works in the system will tell you there's a lot of things in the system that need to change. Shaking it up could be a good thing, but terrorizing the workforce is not going to help them do their jobs.
When I texted you maybe a couple months ago asking you to do this, you responded, and I felt it was like a trademark you, but it was a response that I realized I'd never seen from a politician before. Here's what you said. You said, "I'm consolidating my views on some things right now and want to make sure we can make the most of the conversation." So I can't remember someone in your line of work saying, I need to think a little bit. I need to read, I need to gather information. I know you've been doing that. And of course, you're consolidating your views not on the papal transfer of power, but on what happened to our country. And being from where you are from, living where you now live in Michigan, uh, I'm sure a lot of that thinking is about you know these people, you know these communities, um, and just a little under half of our country is still in the grips of something that you have described as so menacing. Many people feel so menacing. What have you learned as you have done that thinking, done that reading, talked to people? I'm curious what you know now that you took a few months to come on the show. What do you know that maybe you didn't know 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago?
Well, what I'm finding is that you've got a lot of people who supported this president on election day, even though they don't like him. So you've got kind of a hardcore MAGA group, and you always will. By the way, the day that he resigned in disgrace, President Nixon had about 25% of the country that was still with him, right? There's always going to be a core. But there's a lot of other people who, had no illusions about either side and were willing to vote for or do anything that seemed like it was going to shake things up, and are now looking at what's happening and saying, wait a minute, this is not making me better off. I just sat with a group of veterans here in Cedar Rapids. That's what I'm doing in Iowa. We're doing a town hall this evening that is sponsored by Vote Vets, which is a nonprofit organization that I've worked with from time to time. But we had just a smaller kind of off the record group at a community college nearby, talking about how folks are being affected by this stuff. Everything from cuts to the VA to a veteran who started a small business after he came out of active duty, and it's a chocolate business. And now he's facing these tariffs on most of the supplies that he really counts on. He's talking about what that means or what that does to him. Um, but I guess what I'm getting at is a lot of folks aren't thinking about all of this in terms of the political or partisan code. They're thinking about how everything happening around them is affecting their lives. And what I think is critically important for people in my party and for people generally who want to bring change is to really listen to what folks are saying, both about what we can all agree is wrong right now, coming out of Washington and in the Trump White House, and what we would do differently than the status quo. I'm very concerned that in my party, we could win in 2026 and still not do the actual work that's necessary. Uh, because clearly, if our economy, our government, our society, and our politics were healthy, we wouldn't be here. Guys like Trump don't just emerge, and countries don't just kind of randomly drift into an authoritarian direction. These things happen when the status quo is so broken that people shed some things they used to really care about in order to try to get some change. So, look, the truth is, I'm still consolidating the way I think about some of these things. When you're in government at the pace that we were working at, you're kind of deploying a lot of the ideas and a lot of the inputs that you got over time. Now, I actually have a chance to slow down, have those conversations, read more, just write more, do things that you just don't get to do when you're in the cabinet. And I'm determined to make the most of that. I think about something that Lincoln said, or supposedly said, which is that if you give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, I would spend the first four sharpening my axe. And it's a good time. I mean, look, obviously there's a lot of activity that can't wait, which is why I'm doing everything I can to help spread a message of what needs to change now. But this is also a time for all of us to sharpen our toolkit.
Do you? I mean, it's implicit in what you just said, but as you know, eh, in some ways, the hydraulics of American politics are still working as normal. In that Trump won, he did a bunch of things that are unpopular. He's bled support for all the reasons you said. I think what continues to be very surprising, or maybe not surprising, is that Democrats are underperforming him,
Mm,
even in those conditions. So it's not that, okay, this guy's really disappointing us
yeah.
or hurting us, and therefore we go here. That migration is not happening. It's the kind of one step without the two step.
Uh-huh.
And probably everybody watching this has their own theory of why and maybe feels that way themselves. Um, you know the party, you've spoken about the party's limitations, you've run within it, you've kind of had different positionalities related to it. When you give me your most honest sense of the Democratic Party's failure to meet this moment in the eyes of virtually everybody I've ever spoken to, uh, and absorb some of that anger. What is most wrong about the current incarnation of your party?
So I break this down into three areas: what we have to say, our actual policies, um, how we say it, our style and message, and where we say it. And in each of those categories, there are things I would defend and things I think need to change. So on the policies, there are policy commitments that I think are unshakable. That run from our belief that it's the wealthy who need to pay more of their fair share in taxes, and not the other way around. To our commitment to a woman's right to choose, and so many of the other things that I would say make me a Democrat and make Democrats committed to what we believe in. But I do think that we need to show more commitment to solving problems that we were viewed as kind of waving away. Immigration and the border felt like something that Democrats would just rather not talk about at all. Even though I think if you got down to it, we have a better prescription for that than what's going on right now. I think there are a number of issues like
But
that
telling
where,
people that the thing that they're saying they're worried about is actually not something to worry
yeah,
about.
when has that ever worked? Like even just in a friendship or a personal relationship, definitely in a marriage. Like you don't say like, "Oh, you shouldn't worry, you shouldn't feel the way you feel. You shouldn't be worried. Like you should be happy," right? That doesn't work, and we fell into that trap. I think with a lot of public safety concerns. And look, the public safety picture is mixed. It is a fact that violent crime went up under the first Trump administration, down during the Biden administration. But that doesn't mean that there weren't very real, understandable concerns about safety that again, I think my party was inclined to sort of wave away. So there's a whole set of things where we should, and the other thing I would add to that is, you know, we've got to have more of a response on some of the things that are about to hit us. And top of the list, I would say, is artificial intelligence. I mean, that's not just about to happen; it's happening, and everybody's vaguely talking about it. Everybody's saying that it's important. Everybody gets that it matters. Except, I guess, for President Trump's education secretary, who called it A1, which makes me think that she doesn't know what AI stands for. She's really worried about our kids. I'm not making this up. Like she
Wow.
said that we need
Wow.
our schools to prepare people for A1.
Yeah. The
But
steak sauce.
yeah, yeah, which is delicious, but not not a top three civilizational challenge right now. Um, But look, I mean, the displacement that could come from that is coming from that right now, is it could be something we haven't seen since the 17th century. And so to contend with that, that's more than just fine tuning some policy, which is what my party likes to think about. We're talking about some really deep questions about how we think labor and community and belonging work. And those are the kinds of things we need to have, I think, sharper answers on. So that's the kind of what we have to
So
say.
before you move on to number two on messaging, just still on policy, um, just to push it a little further, there is this, there has been and is still this kind of raging argument within your party about center versus progressives. There was some synthesis of those things under Biden, I
Yep.
would argue, but you still have groups like Third Way in Washington saying the only way to beat someone like Trump is to go back to basically a kind of Robert Rubin-ish
Yep.
consensus. And then you have people, Abdul Sayed is running for Senate in Michigan, as you know. We was just on with us last week saying the opposite. He said
Yep.
we can't beat something with nothing. We can't do this little tinkering, Bill Clinton stuff. We need to be bold. Policies that people cannot stop texting their mother-in-law about. Those are two really different visions, right?
Yep.
You ran in a primary where there was a version of that kind of schism. Um, how do you feel you would show up differently on that question in this moment, given what's happening, given people's disconnect from the party?
Well, I think, look, I'm known not to be the leftmost figure in my party, but I also don't think tinkering is going to do the job right now. I mean, again, the clear message from so many people I've encountered, especially people who voted with us and then against us from one election to the next, but also just substantively, not just politically, but substantively, is you just cannot be the case that in a society that is losing its grip on democracy, that has reached extreme levels of wealth and income inequality, and that is confronting in the form of AI what might be the most profound restructuring of our relationship between labor and capital since the 18th, 17th century. It just can't be that what we need to do is fine tune a bunch of stuff we inherited from the 90s that we started building in the 40s. It's just not true. So that's the level. And this is the other thing that I think is kind of a hard thing for the left to accept, which is that the right actually has a clearer relationship between some of their first principles and their politics and policy today. And what I mean by it, don't get me wrong, like it's a mess under Trumpism because you got techno libertarians, and these kind of populists like Hawley and Vance to some extent, kind of coexisting with traditional conservatives who just want to cut taxes for the wealthy and get rid of regulations. There's a lot of contradictions there, but look at how the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute and that apparatus deals with really big philosophical questions, comes up with right-wing answers to those questions, and then pushes those out through the policy and political machinery of the Republican Party. On our side, what I'm really worried about is the exact question that you were just reflecting on is completely framed with reference to what the Republicans are doing. Our big policy fight shouldn't be how close do we come to the Republicans or how ferociously do we act against them? It should be what do we believe in and what does it imply? We need to be deriving more of what we believe from our core principles, universal American values, and specifically progressive values, and then take that out into the policy and political world, not just always look at what the other guys are doing and solve off of that. How ferociously we're going to fight it and how much we're going to accommodate it. That is the wrong question to be asking, or at least it's not the most important question to be asking.
Is there an example of a big, bold policy idea that you would support in 2025 that maybe you didn't even support in 2020?
I mean, look, part of what I'm doing right now is evaluating the new policy ideas that are emerging and thinking about things we need to do. I mean, I think I would definitely take a harder look at the things that make it difficult to build or do anything in this country. Having spent 4 years, getting a lot done, but also, frankly, banging my head against a lot of those barriers when I was trying to build infrastructure across the country with the infrastructure bill. So that's just one medium-sized example. But again, we should be looking at things from like what is the right amount of what should a work week look like in an AI world, and what is a basic level of income that people require. It's clear that our measurements of poverty are completely not up to the task of defining what real economic insecurity looks like right now. And those lead to a lot of policy implications that are just
Do you think a universal basic income, the Andrew Yang kind of idea, is a good one?
I think that some kind of backstop is important, but there are different ways to structure it. I'm more interested in exploring things that deal the American people in on the value being created with intellectual property that the American taxpayer paid for, specifically the internet and AI, um, and other things that can create some kind of limit to just how much wealth and power can be concentrated in a few hands. Um, and look, there's a lot of things I think we got right, as well as wrong, in recent years. And I think one of the areas where we were on the right track was standing more with consumers. The fact that it's definitely something I worked on, obviously when it came to airline passenger protections, but also in making sure that bank customers were better protected. The work of the CFPB, which the current administration is trying to gut. Things that didn't get nearly enough attention. Even stuff like the click to cancel rule that the FTC advanced. This is the idea that if you could click your way into a subscription, you should be able to click your way out of that subscription without having to be on the line with somebody that was never going to pick up an 800 number. That kind of orientation, that might sound like more of a nuisance issue, but it really adds up economically for people. And talking about and working on those kinds of things, I think, was something we should have done even more of.
What's something you admire, maybe against your own better judgment, about the way Trump operates, uses power?
Admire is, maybe not the
It's a
right I
complicated
mean,
word.
look, I recognize the effectiveness well, let me say this, I mean, to my earlier point, even though he, of course, lied to the public about it, the truth is that he's following a Project 2025 playbook, which, like most Americans, I detest the substance of it. But again, it demonstrates that there was serious, advanced long developed policy thinking that informed this administration. Now, he said he's never read it. I believe him, but like he set up an administration that is executing this playbook, right? And I think that our side, again, has been so transfixed by their side that we have neglected to develop our own policy answers to some of these things, especially during this period when we're out of power, where it's critically important to do that. So, I think that is something that obviously the substance of it I disagree with, but strategically, I think it's really important to recognize how powerful that is.
You and I talked about this last time. It was a really fascinating conversation about your faith that building the things that the way to fight authoritarianism in this country was to actually build the things that would make people's lives better, reduce collective stress, improve the well-being of the country by people not having as long a commute or as stressful a commute, those kinds of, easy air travel, and that you had a certain faith that that kind of improved well-being would blunt those trends. And I kind of went back and forth on that afterward because it's a lot that you're trying to meet head on. And I wonder now, as you look at the moment we're in, do you still have faith that the kind of technocratic approach, the evidence-driven approach, the data-driven approach, the careful approach works against the flashbang of populist authoritarianism? Do you think there's a need for a fundamental rethink about whether sobriety and and carefulness can match what is coming from the other side?
To me, the key isn't carefulness; it's delivery, right? So my view was that just making sure that government could deliver for people and that your everyday experience was better would lead to more public trust, which would lead to a better political environment. I still believe that. We worked on a lot of things toward that. Obviously, 4 years was not enough to deliver some of those things. I think actually, from a transportation perspective, at least, if there had been a 6-year term rather than a 4-year term, it's remarkable how different that might have been because of how long it takes to kind of complete some of these things. But look, the truth is, part of why some of those things take longer than they should is that we are too careful about delivery. So to me, like people hear about delivery, maybe they think technocratic, but to me, sometimes you have to be very bold in order to deliver stuff. I mean, this is the part that I think we should retain from the FDR vision. That he look sometimes he moved fast and broke things. but they also delivered. Now, right now, the problem is they're moving fast and breaking things, but they're not breaking things in order to build other things. They're just breaking things, and that's all the difference.
I wanted to ask you about go deeper into the kind of issue around the Democratic Party. I've spoken to so many people who say, look, it's not even really a party organization. It is the DNC is a fundraising vessel. You were talking about the kind of where uh, earlier. It's an organization that is kind of physically absent from a lot of the country, including where you grew up. Um, it is an organization that, in many ways, has not reconciled its relationship to donors versus the public. I think certainly talking to people all over the country the last few months, it's an organization that people feel asks for $5 all the time, and then when you need defending, when you're terrified in these last few months, as so many people are, it's like it sort of goes to you harder than a 25-year-old guy in a dating app. So, oh, do you share? I'm sure you have a more nuanced picture, but are people wrong? I mean, I'm sure everyone who lives around you tells you
Yeah.
this. Like, are people wrong to feel so profoundly undefended by this organization?
Well, one thing that's changed in the way I look at things compared to, gosh, now 8 years ago when I ran for chair of the DNC versus now, is that I think less and less of the DNC and the Democratic Party as the same thing. Obviously, the DNC is important, and I want and need it to succeed. But the DNC houses certain specific pieces of political machinery. But the party, like the party with a capital P, to me is Americans who share a set of values and a set of policy commitments that could light the way to a better future, and who can be united not just in opposition to some pretty horrific stuff that we're seeing right now, but also in the name of a better future where there is greater equality of democratic power and a fairer economy, all the other things that we believe in. And that I've tried to make a case for in a different vocabulary around freedom and security and democracy and family, things that make code conservative, but that I think are what Democrats are really about. I think it might be unfair to assume or expect that the DNC per se is supposed to solve all of that, because what we really need is for everybody who believes in these values, who thinks of themselves as a Democrat, or even if you don't think of yourself as a Democrat, but you're an independent voter or thinker who knows that things need to change, to organize and participate in ways that are just so different from what it was like even when I was a kid, and definitely a generation or two ago, when joining the party could only mean that you walk into a county party office and start making buttons and stapling packets together. By the way, which is still like a beautiful and important part of the democratic process, but like so much of it now is online. So much of it is relational. It's just different now. And rather than wait for the DNC to take command of all of that, I think those of us who think of ourselves as Democrats should figure out where each of us fit in. And I think that's a message I have for people who are following this conversation too, who feel a bit disempowered, who are thinking like, I can't wait a year and a half till the next election to make a difference. Stuff's going on now. They're moving fast. I don't know if we're going to have fair elections in the future. And if you're thinking that, feeling that, then you're saying, what can and should I do? And it turns out things you can do from the people I saw on the street corner in Traverse City over the weekend, standing out there with signs, which is old fashioned but important, to the people who have been such a presence at the town halls of Republican members of Congress that the Republican members of Congress have stopped having town halls, um, are in fact making a very real difference. And not all of that is, or frankly, should be organized through a traditional party machinery.
As you know, David Hogg ran as a kind of young candidate for the vice chair in the DNC and is now being sort of pushed out. Do you think they're doing a mistake, making a mistake by pushing him out?
I haven't followed all of the kind of inside baseball going on there. I think that look, what he's talking about is I think something that definitely as a Democrat, as a voter, I get, which is like just because you're in office. I mean, frankly, I lived this because I was up for reelection, and the primary was often a tough fight. You can't just assume that you get to stay because you're an incumbent Democrat. Now, how that butts up against the principle that if you're organizing any of the processes in the party, you have a responsibility to be neutral. That's something I candidly haven't reflected on to the extent that I would weigh in on the bylaws of the party or something like that. But look, I do think, and I've known David for a long time, and one thing that I think he is very importantly putting forward is that there will continue to be dissatisfaction with the party and its leaders if there's a feeling that all we got to do is kind of play the same old political baseball and expect a better result.
Do you think? I mean, obviously, it's a very sensitive topic, the topic of age in politics. Um, but I think when you have the age distribution we do in our politics, you also can't not talk about it. Um, and there's a gerontocracy problem in the Democratic Party and Congress in general. Um, but for a party that represents the values you're talking about, that wants to make a case for the future, that is trying to build and rebuild trust with young people. Um, Not talking about one or two leaders here or there. Do you think there's just a need for a generational overhaul? You obviously tried to bring that yourself personally, but I wonder at a much broader level, dozens and dozens of people. Do you think it's time for? Would you say respectfully to some of the older folks in your party? You had a great run. You served. You've done an honorable thing. Maybe it's time for a kind of mass step aside for new people to come in.
I think that that's what primary processes are about. So it's one thing to say that, but nobody gets to tell somebody to do that. You compete, and as many have shown. I mean, you think about AOC's emergence on the political scene, right? She said, "I'm not going to wait my turn. I have a different message. Here I come." And in a way, I generationally was doing a version of that, running for president in my 30s. Obviously, I didn't win. But I was bringing a different generational message. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a straightforward, kind of straight line thing, right? One of the people who has most galvanized young people in this country is Bernie Sanders, who I think is now getting well into his 80s. But I do think it's clear that many figures in my party have struggled to do what Nancy Pelosi did, for example, who remains a very effective member of Congress, but said that she was ready to step aside from leadership. And I keep thinking about this meeting I had toward the end of my time as secretary with one of my European counterparts, and they had just had an election, and toward the end of the meeting said, "By the way, you're not going to see me again in this capacity." I said, "Well, what are you doing next?" He said, "Well, I think it's really time for me to step aside from elected office and let a younger generation take over." And I remember going back in my office after the meeting to look him up on Wikipedia. He was in his mid-50s. And it showed how different the culture was in his country. But look, I'm not here to say you have to be this young or this old to do a good job. But fundamentally, do we need more generational change, younger figures in leadership and in office? Yes, we do.
You mentioned AOC. I wanted to ask you. I got a call from a New York Times reporter a couple months ago, maybe, who was doing a story about next generation Democratic Party leadership, and she was just calling around a bunch of people who are maybe talk too much like me, and to give their thoughts. And we ended up talking about you, and I ended up talking with her about you and AOC. And what I said to her, and I'm curious how this lands with you, and is that, and I know both of you personally a little bit more than I know a lot of other people. And it struck me that while the two of you have kind of landed very differently ideologically, not completely, but you're at different places in the Democratic Party spectrum. Um, I said to this reporter that you both strike me in different ways as people who have this kind of capacity to hold the breath of the country in your mind and in your heart, right? Um, which is not what we not often talk about in politics. But every time I talk to you, I feel like you just have an instinct for the breadth of who lives here. And even if you are over here, it never quite leaves your mind the breadth of who we share the country with. And she, even though she's known as this progressive firebrand, she came up in organizing in Texas and she has this other side of her that is actually deeply open to all kinds of people needing to be brought into the coalition. And you see that in this fighting oligarchy tour. I wonder what your relationship is with her, if any, how you see someone like her. You both are the two people most people are talking about as next generation leaders. Tell me about how you see her and what relationship there is there, if any.
Yeah, I recognize what you're talking about, and yeah, really appreciated opportunities to work with her when I was in Washington. I think the first time we met was actually at the dog park close to where the U.S. DOT was, and near where she was living at the time. And from time to time, had opportunities to talk about where things were headed, both from a political perspective and in terms of the policy side. And look, we didn't always come down in the same place for sure, especially on the infrastructure bill, but have enormous respect for how she has brought a lot of people into the process and into the picture. And obviously, she comes from a very different part of the country than I do. But I imagine in her own story and origin has that sense of how politics is about encountering and working with and trying to persuade people who are very different from you. That was my experience. Look, I grew up in a 50-50 county in Indiana. Right now, I live in a 50-50 county in Michigan. I'm literally physically co-located with people who represent a real breadth of ideological difference. And I know because of that fact, I know that many of them or some of them are ready to entertain very different ideas, or at least think twice when you talk to them on their terms. But you have to actually do it, which is why I go on Fox News, why I'm spending more time in podcasts and online spaces that have not been really progressive oriented. Let's put it that way. In recent years, but I believe that politics is about encounter. Politics is about persuasion, and I think there are a lot. I think the best and most effective political figures, left, right, or center, are ones who see that, understand that, and do something about it.
Do you think of AOC as someone you could have a kind of partnership with one day?
We belong to the same party. I think we share many of the same core values, and I think it's all hands on deck right now for anybody who wants things in this country to change quickly, and that's going to mean continuing to team up with folks who are to my left, to my right, and in between. And the other thing that we need to recognize is that people's political preferences are complicated, and somebody might code left on one thing and right on another. I think that's definitely true with a lot of the young men I've met and talked to, students I worked with when I was at the University of Chicago this last spring. Some of whom voted for Biden once and then for Trump. Mostly younger white men who are not ideologues and who could absolutely be part of this coalition. But if we don't get them soon, then their votes will become sort of habit forming, um, and that'll be really we'll be in permanent trouble.
So you brought this upon yourself by being in Iowa. It's not my fault. You're in Iowa, a great state with your Vote Vets event tonight. But lots of people in the chat saying, "Will you run for president?" Uh, I know you're a deliberate person. I know there's not some answer in your head probably that
Yeah,
you're withholding from us. My guess is you don't know. Um,
that's right.
you're thinking about things. You're a deliberate person. Can you just share how you are thinking about that? I mean, I've never had a project like that on my to-do list. Decide if you're running for president. What are the components of a to-do list task? Decide if you are running for president. How do you go about it?
Well, what you're describing, obviously, any kind of decision process there is a long way off. But look, I just went through this process actually twice because I looked at running for governor of Michigan. I looked at running for Senate in Michigan when Gary Peters decided he wasn't going to run again in 2026. And I followed a process that I've followed from the very first time that I ran for office when I was, I think, 27 back in Indiana, which is to assess the office and what it calls for, substantively and politically, what it needs, and then to try as honestly as possible to assess what I bring to the table and how it's different from the others. And there are times I followed that process and decided to run, and there are times I followed that process and decided not to run. And the process can lead you to surprising places. It can lead to something that I think surprised a lot of people, which is my deciding not to run for Senate in Michigan this time around. It was also surprising for most people, obviously, when I decided I would run for president while I was in my second term as mayor of South Bend, Indiana. But I was looking at, okay, here you have this nomination that, in my view, called for a generational fresh start, a better vocabulary for talking about the industrial Midwest, a focus on the future, more groundedness in local politics and community life versus the ways of Washington, and suddenly started to see why somebody who was a mayor in the so-called Rust Belt, who hadn't been marinating in Washington for a long time and had a different style, could be the right answer for what my party and what our country needed. That's the process that I believe in. It's what I recommend for any young people I talk to who are thinking about maybe running for office. And and then obviously the other thing you're mapping against all of that is your life. I mean, the stakes are always high for somebody thinking about running for visible political office, but they're fundamentally different when you've got a spouse and kids. And Chasten and I were married when I first ran for president, but our kids were not on the scene. You weigh that very differently, obviously, and having kids can motivate you to run, but it can also motivate you to spend more time at home.
And obviously, when you were growing up, being gay was could be dangerous. It could be a source of bullying and worse. I think it kept you from coming out till later than you might have. Um, do you think now, as you meet people, encounter people, go to communities that are maybe more red, purple, um, do you think being gay is still a hindrance in terms of people connecting with you and adopting ideas that they would hear from you? Do you still feel it as a headwind in any way? Do you think it's gone for you as you personally experience dealing with citizens? Where do you think that headwind is?
Look, it's still a thing. I wish it wasn't, but it is. And one thing that's really struck me is talking to students who, look, like probably most people in our generation, I like to think of myself as not that far out of college. But of course, the reality is, I'm sitting down with students, especially when I was spending a day a week at the University of Chicago, and doing the mental math and realizing to my crushing disappointment that they were not alive when I was in college, right? So just a totally different generation. And yet, a lot of them are really struggling with this. Like I meet with a lot of young LGBTQ plus students who tell me about how difficult it is to come out as gay in their high school or whatever it is they went through. And so the reality is this is a thing in our society, definitely in our politics. But another reality is that there are, I think, more chances than ever for people to get to know you, get to know all of you, and not define you by this or that kind of feature of your bio or your identity. Um, I think that for all of the harm it has unleashed, one helpful thing about the digital ecosystem that we're in is it's created ways for that to happen. I also think a lot of offline experiences help that to happen. I had the benefit of being mayor and having a lot of people in my socially conservative community in Indiana know me well at the time that I came out, which meant that they could see this as something about me versus seeing identity first and then only then being able to have any you know process of learning who I was. So is it a thing? Sure, um, but you know for one thing, my experience winning the Iowa caucuses back when I was running for president showed, as my experience, being reelected with more votes than I did the first time around in my Indiana hometown showed that you can cut through those things and have a conversation about all of what politics is really supposed to be about, which is not you, the candidate. It's the voter and what the voter needs and wants and expects from their leaders, their nominees, their government.
Last thing before I let you go, I know your kids are small and you're still just in the trenches of the sheer physical reality of that age. Um, but I want you to cast your mind ahead, years ahead. Your kids grow up, they're grown, they're maybe approaching your age, and they have kids. And you're sitting one day uh, in Traverse City or wherever, um, and one of those grandkids is on your lap and has read about 2025 in the history books.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe saw a movie about it and, AI goggles or something like that. Um, and asks you, what did you do?
Hmm.
How did you try to step up in that moment? Um, I wonder what you would like to tell them.
Well, I mean, look, that's what keeps me going, right? That's why I do what I do. When I'm actively running for office or holding office, and when I'm not, it's wanting to have a good answer for them, and for them better for my own kids. I haven't thought much about what it would be like to have a grandkids on my knee, mostly because we're still trying to survive some of the
Don't I
long
know it?
tail of potty training and some of the other things that happen when your kids are 3. Um, but yeah, I mean, obviously, I want them to grow up and have a chance to become parents, and I want them to be great parents, and I want to do my best to, as Chaps and I try to every day, to be good parents to them. And part of that's at home, and part of that's out in the world. I guess I want to be able to tell them that at this moment, when it was extremely precarious, when the American experiment was really teetering on the brink of becoming something else, when it was not clear what kind of future our country or our communities would have, that I was part of the effort that turned all of that around, that I contributed to them having the abundance that they live in, that I was contributing to them having the stability that they live in, that the reason why they confidently lived in America that was leading the world and that was prosperous and that had conquered its many of its toughest demons, from racial and economic injustice to climate change to how to handle the onset of AI. That we did that, and that's why they were safe. That's why they didn't have to worry about becoming a statistic among American road deaths, or being treated fairly when they applied for a job, or whether the air that they could breathe was going to be clean, or whether their vote would count, or whether they could write an op-ed and wind up getting in trouble with the government for it. I want to be able to tell them I was there for that, and that's, I think, what everybody who gets involved in politics or activism is hoping for. I actually think that if we get it right, and there's a lot of ways we could get it wrong, and by we I just mean like America right now. We obviously show a lot of risk of getting it wrong, but if we got it right, this would be a moment that would actually be romanticized in the future, precisely because it's so painful and difficult now. Like, I remember being young, envying my parents for having been around in the 60s, and being young at a time when there was so much, all this culture and music and rebellion. And my mom sitting me down one time and saying, it was terrible. Like, people we admired were getting assassinated. My friends were going to the Vietnam War. Protesters were getting shot. Like, it was a tough, tough time. That later on, because things like unfolded in a certain way, and because in certain very important fights that played out in the 60s, that the right side won. Now you look back on it and romanticize it, but it was not fun at the time. And sometimes I think about that now, that this could be one of those periods where, precisely because it's so brutal, it comes to be one of those times we most admire. There's any historical figure we admire came to our attention based on things they did in a brutally difficult time. And we're in a brutally difficult time, but we do not run the risk of living in a time that doesn't matter. And so what I know is that that question's coming from our kids and grandkids as soon as they're old enough to ask it. And better do everything I can to make sure that we're answering that question from a perspective of, here's how we made it right, versus that's when it all went wrong forever.
Secretary Pete Buttigieg, thank you so much. Good luck tonight in Iowa. Your voice is always so vital in this country in this moment. So, really great chatting with you as always.
Hey, same here. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in. All 8,000 of you.